Connecting with purpose is about doing what matters most in a time when our families, workplaces, and communities need us. This show from Purpose Views presents honest conversations about what's possible when we invest in helping our people be their best, purposeful selves. You'll hear the challenges of making those investments and tips for reaping their rewards. This show is designed to help people-first leaders like you create the impact you seek. Let me introduce you to the purpose-driven and real-talking hosts, Mark, Neil, and Nell.
Welcome everybody to Connecting with Purpose. I'm really honoured to have Dr. Nigel Girgrah here with me today, who has been dedicating his life as a physician and now executive in the world of healthcare, making lives better for everybody. But Nigel's really unique title nowadays is Chief Wellness Officer, and it's such an incredibly important area for us to explore, and we're really excited to have Nigel here with us today to talk about some of the opportunities and challenges in the healthcare sector, his experience specifically within the Oschner Health System, which in and of itself serves thousands and thousands of people every year, and of course the intersection between well-being, purpose and performance, and how we can support all our people being at their absolute best. So with that as a very high level intro, Nigel, as I said before, we'll put all the details of your bio into the notes for everybody. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Great to be here.
You're very welcome. I'm excited for this conversation, and we're bringing back something. We're bringing back something on. Just before we start talking about kind of what you've learned about your own purpose, I'd love to just hear maybe three magic moments from a career perspective, if you like, or at least ones that have been relevant to your career.
Yeah.
Magic moments being kind of 10 out of 10 moments when you look back on them, like, wow, whether it was a positive moment at the time or a big challenge or something that you had to overcome, the impact that had on what came next. What would be sort of three things that spring to mind when you look back on your career that would be magic moments now?
Yeah, I guess maybe magic or crucible moments, because some of them didn't seem magical at the time, and some of them weren't really moments. They were eras. But I guess one that comes to mind, actually, it was a moment, and I remember the day. It was April 25th, 2001. It was actually about 11 o'clock in the morning, and I was doing procedures in the endoscopy lab in Toronto. And my son had been ill, but I'd been a little dismissive, thinking it was just a viral URI. And I remember being in the endoscopy suite and getting a call that he had basically a terminal brain tumor. So everything sort of kind of stopped. It was a haunting moment. He subsequently passed away 3 months later. And I guess when I reflect on that, it was sort of a time of maybe healthy recklessness, healthy in that it forced you to sort of take stock of your life, what matters most from a personal perspective and from a professional perspective, and maybe make some changes. So that was, I think, one moment. Maybe number two, I can rate them afterwards. Number two was actually a moment. It was June 2006, and I was here in New Orleans interviewing post-Katrina for my role here. And I'll tell you, it was kind of for about a day and a half, it'd been a very average recruitment. I had been just curious, and I was kind of eager to get home, thinking this was interesting, but it's not going to happen. And I think the main recruiter, George Loss, he's a surgeon, sort of recognized during dinner as kind of average. And as he was taking me back to the hotel, he said, let's stop. Let's stop for a drink. and he took me to a bar in New Orleans called Monkey Hill, the Monkey Hill Bar. And I remember there was a Heat Magic or a Heat Mavericks game, playoff game. And over the next 3 hours, we talked with curiosity, we talked with passion, and we developed kind of a sense, a shared sense of destiny. And I left, 2-3 hours later, thinking that this is where I want to be. This is somebody I want to work for, and I think there'll be, magical possibilities. So that was a moment. And then if I have to go back to a time at the time somewhat negative, would be the summer of 2020, so the first summer of the pandemic, when I sort of, like many, struggled with my own mental health challenges, certainly got better, but decided somewhere during that summer that I was just going to be more vocal, more assertive, be a spokesperson. And I think as I reflect, I sort of, from a mental health perspective and an advocate, sort of morphed from sort of scientist to evangelist and just sort of speaking about it. So those are three moments. I think they were all, the first one, just in terms of impact on my life, Bennett's death and diagnosis would be a 10 out of 10. Certainly other ones have been significant. I don't know where they're up there 8, 9, or 10, I would say, Mark.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I, you've shared with me as well some of the letters that you wrote to your employees, which I think one of the first ones was around that summer of 2020, and just the transparency and openness and the vulnerability combined with the courage you need to be able to, as a senior executive, lead by example in that way and say, look, I feel like this. I'm guessing a lot of us feel like this. Let's talk about it. And so I appreciate you sharing those moments and the mix of those and the considerable impact, obviously, that your son's passing would have had. We've talked about that before. When you look back on those three moments and any other things that you think are kind of relevant, and you've talked about, yes, it's an opportunity to take stock and kind of just look at things differently, and then the recruitment conversation that morphed into more of an authentic, engaging, organic conversation that was nothing to do, whatever it was about, right? But it was just the connection, that natural kind of connection you're able to have with somebody, and then you fast forward to sharing the mental health challenges you were having as a very senior leader in an organization that was going through unprecedented challenges. What does that tell you about your purpose as an individual?
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit more later in the discussion about the summer of 2020, because I learned a lot. And each one of those moments or times, it's really just a sort of greater understanding yourself in the context of what's going on in the world and being more comfortable with yourself. And I think that's one of the few silver linings of age, really, is that evolution. I think my purpose is really about building teams where there's joy in the workplace. It's as simple as that, where folks feel inspired to do great things, and really the recognition that the right team that is working like no one's watching, sort of like dancing while no one's watching, is far greater than the sum of the parts. So I think that really sums up my purpose, and how you sort of apply, whether it's being a leader in transplant, or whether it's being a leader in the workforce well-being, or whether it's being an advocate for mental health. It's sort of bringing those things together, if that makes any sense.
Well, yeah, 100% it makes sense. I think that whole, inspiring teams to do great things, and finding the joy in that experience, which then in turn kind of creates that positive cycle to do more great things, and do them together. It is an incredibly powerful purpose, and I think everyone would appreciate the connectivity between that and people's well-being, in order to just having a holistic sense of positive well-being, in order to be able to find joy and be able to sort of perform and be inspired to do great things. And that how mental health plays a role in that. And we're definitely going to kind of dig into more of your experiences around those areas, after this next question, which is kind of the flip side of, if that's your purpose, what's purpose not to you? When you hear people talk about purpose sometimes in businesses or even maybe in the healthcare system, and they're talking about individuals and their purpose and that sort of thing, what's one of those things you probably call out and say, hang on, that's not purpose?
Yeah, well, for me, and it's a personal thing, not building is not having purpose. This expression, playing not to lose rather than playing to win. I can't be satisfied with having built something, and this may be actually a weakness, going to just maintenance phase or stewardship of a program. And I actually think Oschner recognized this before I did. I think they've been very good at not just looking at me, but at, in 5-year segments of my career, and okay, what can Nigel do next? But I get very anxious when I feel that something I'm building is just going to move to sort of, this is good, let's put it in cruise control.
Yeah.
So that is not me, and in fact, it can be disengaging when that happens. It doesn't happen very often, and I snap out of it, but that's not my purpose.
Yeah, and I think then, I get it. Yeah, just that's not building. That's not the definition of building. That's just kind of maintenance, as far as you're concerned. It's not the definition of great things. It's not the definition of inspiring. Regardless of whether there may be some joy along the way, it's not going to get people to the place that you want them to be doing these great things. So when you think back on your experiences, then what have been some examples that spring to mind of when you feel you've maybe best case examples of, like, this was a great example of when we were able to inspire this team and build this team to do something great? Like, what were some of the practices maybe that you had to employ in order to get that great result?
When I reflect on the early days of my career here in transplant, or the early days of building the Office of Professional Wellbeing, it's bringing people together, recognizing that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and to the extent that we can complement each other, create a high degree of psychological safety within the team, that in itself will, I think, is one of the critical ingredients to success in anything. So, when in transplant, we were the largest program for 7 years in a row in liver transplant. That was great, but it was the year before, around 2011, recognizing, gosh, we've built a great team and something magical is about to happen. That is really cool. And the same thing with the Office of Professional Wellbeing. Honestly, I didn't know if there's going to be any roadmap for success, but when you bring people together and there's a creativity and there's just a joy in working together, great things can happen.
Yeah, so bringing people together, creativity, joy, understanding people's strengths and weaknesses as to how you can kind of complement each other. How does the inspire piece play in? I'm guessing that just in the world that you're in, people are genuinely there to save lives. Like that's probably an underlying motivator. Everyone contributes to that in their own way,
Yeah.
regardless of whether a nurse or a surgeon or a C-level executive managing the organization. When you were building those two examples, the transplant team and the Office of Wellbeing, like, what's the inspiration piece? Is it there? Is it just naturally there within the people, or is it something that you have to sort of tap into for the team or for each individual on the team?
Well, I think in general, when I guess my background is healthcare, and when you think about sort of purpose, well-being, and tying that to performance, I think the healthcare profession, in the overwhelming majority of cases, enlists individuals who are intrinsically purpose-driven. They're talented. They generally have a track record of performance. And I think at times, Mark, we're sort of flummoxed that why doesn't that foundation of purpose-driven individuals with a shared sense of values and beliefs consistently translate to performance? And I think I think about Dan Pink, who wrote the book Drive, which is basically about motivation. And sure, he talked about purpose, but he also talked about mastery and autonomy. And I think, with healthcare individuals, to take things from purpose to performance, you can't forget about mastery and autonomy. And ask yourself, are there things, are there things imposed on those you work with, either externally by regulatory agencies, insurance companies, or internally, that impedes mastery, so top of license work, gets in the way of autonomy and interferes with that natural connection between purpose and performance, if that makes any sense at all. So it's always appropriate, always essential to talk about purpose. Purpose is everything, but you have to put that in the context of other motivators.
Yeah, it completely resonates, and in all our work, we kind of have purpose as foundational, but it's the beginning of a plan. If the purpose is the why and the essence of you at your best, kind of why you exist, it's, well, where are you trying to get to? What are you going to focus on, and how are you going to get there as the best version of yourself? All those things play in.
And it may be a different discussion in, say, accounting. I shouldn't speak, but maybe there is more of a role in, say, working at Starbucks or working at elite legal companies to inspire purpose. But I think in healthcare, for most, we went into the profession as medical students or as nursing students or as healthcare professionals because there was that sense of wanting to do good for society.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case, and then people understanding how they can bring their best selves to that and contribute in the best way, and that certainly mastery and autonomy combined with purpose are a great way of supporting people in getting there. And maybe an inhibitor you've personally experienced and you've talked about and been a real advocate for is mental health, and of course an enabler or an inhibitor, of course, depending on where your mental health is. You've been open in advocating for this. How do you see, how do you support people's mental health in the healthcare industry, where I'm guessing there's a lot of successes to celebrate. There's a lot of tragedy that you kind of have to deal with as well. But then on top of all that, there's been a pandemic that just created so many stresses on the system that it would have been almost impossible for people to not feel some form of mental health challenges. What have you seen, and how have you been able to support people's mental health in order to keep that performance and inspire those teams to do great things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure how well I will answer it, but I have my own. I've had an evolution in how I understand how I can inspire trust and motivate others. So, I think, a major purpose or major thing that I want to do is support the mental health needs of my colleagues. And I think prior to the first summer in the pandemic, I actually think a lot about Frances Fry from the Harvard Business School. I've seen her speak, and she had talked and talks, and I think this makes sense completely about the three components of building trust within your teams. One is logic, and I think historically, being a scientist, being a physician, I've always tended to try and double down on logic, creating a business case, and thinking that by itself will resonate with individuals. The second component, I think, is reasonably natural to me, and that's empathy. I would like to think that most people think, I'm an empathetic listener, and, I'm generally empathetic. I think before the pandemic, my wobble was on the third component, and that was authenticity. And, I think that summer really allowed me to just be more comfortable in my skin, be able to share with boundaries. So I think boundaries is important. My vulnerabilities, my warts, and in doing so as a leader, make others feel more comfortable reaching out about, about their personal stories. And that summer, I'm not sure I really even realized it. I used this this term languishing, but in retrospect, it was certainly likely depression or anxiety. We talked about Bennett. The summer represents the anniversary of his birth in 2020, and then his death the following year in July of 2021. And usually I recognize the triggers, but we all have compensatory mechanisms. And my compensatory mechanisms were to go back to Canada around the anniversary, spend time with family and loved ones. And, during the pandemic, we couldn't travel. So that was gone. I'd suffered my first major injury, a quad tendon rupture, so I couldn't exercise. So that was, and so things just seemed to be spiraling out of control. I didn't know whether this was going to be a deal breaker for me as an organizational leader. And happy ending, I reached out for help, got better quickly. But my sort of aha moment, or my big bet, was that many, Mark, have some version of that story, maybe more minor, maybe more significant, but are just too timid to reach out for help. So over the course of August of that year, I started to think about composing an open letter, an email. I have a quarterly email that goes out to folks, but historically, and this gets back to the authenticity and vulnerability, historically, those emails had just been report outs, logic. This is the things that we've done. This is the difference it's making. But I thought storytelling in that situation would be a better format. So I composed a letter that went out early in September, where I talked a little bit about the story I shared about myself and my struggles. But then in that letter, I talked a little more broadly about the stigma in healthcare with respect to mental health. And I'd gotten approval from a couple of executives, but honestly, I was really anxious about sending that out. I didn't know whether the state licensing board was going to start asking questions or just whether it wouldn't be well received. And I think that email went out on a Thursday. It was sort of pushed out around 7:30 in the morning. And I left home to come to work, and I remember opening up my Outlook, and there were like 50 to 100 email replies. Not just thank you, but emails where people were talking about their own stories. Emails sort of saying this would be their call to action. So I think, getting back to Francis Fry, I think to the extent that you can be authentic, not in isolation, be authentic along with being empathetic and along with being logical, that's going to be a better recipe for building trust, and building trust is really the foundation for inspiring people, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that the emotional engagement that you got from having the courage to share that story and how you were feeling, and that you'd reached out for help, and which outweighed some of your anxiety, which is natural about sending it. What did you see in the immediate term? Obviously, thank you, and here's my story, and this resonates, and that I could see that kind of tidal wave of engagement. What did you see that came maybe off the back of that? Whether it's cultural changes or little things you were able to then implement that maybe were just a little bit easier or more effective because you demonstrated at the top level this true openness and understanding and care for everybody.
Well, again, I hope I don't sound like an egomaniac taking credit for this, because there's certainly others in the organization. But I think, when I look at 3 years later, mental health and well-being is much more part of the organizational fabric and culture. It's part of how we conduct departmental meetings, how we develop strategy, how our other executives talk to others, leadership communication norms. There's been a greater focus on not just destigmatizing, not just raising awareness, but how do we experiment with how we support individuals outside the traditional EAP offering, which is essential, but how do we get more upstream, more on demand? And so there's been much more of a glassness or an openness, I think, within the organization. And then I think equally exciting externally, Oschner is an influential organization, particularly in the Gulf South, and being able to use that influence to start discussions with other organizations, professional societies, licensing boards. So it's never one thing, it's a series of things and a series of discussions and building momentum. But that's exciting to me. I mean, just several months ago, the state licensing board on the physician side announced that it was taking out questions when you renew your license that had to do with mental health. And I think that may sound symbolic, but that's important. You can talk all you want about it's okay to talk about mental health, but if you ask these questions every year, you're sending a signal that maybe it's not okay to talk about it. So all those things are exciting to me. And I think we're in an exciting place in 2023 right now.
Thanks for sharing those. If you don't mind, I'd like to double click on any one or two of them, just to give the audience a couple of practical examples, because I think sometimes it's about seeing as we'd say in England, the wood for the trees. Maybe it's the forest for the trees in America, I'm not sure, but when you're in it, sometimes it's just the little things that can make a difference. And so when you say it kind of destigmatized mental health, created a sense of openness and acceptance, and there were some norms that became the norm, and some experiments that you were able to do. Some of the areas you were saying were like, well, it affected how we ran meetings, how we developed strategy, the types of conversations we've had, the way we lead. Have you got a couple of kind of just examples of any one of those about, or how do you run a meeting, or what is a leadership norm, or what is a type of conversation that embraces that understanding of mental health?
Sure. I mean, one example, I think many organizations have either an established or an emerging focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a chief diversity officer. We have employee resource groups, which I think have been very effective. I thought, and had several conversations, wouldn't it be appropriate to have a resource group around mental health? So I reached out to Deb Grimes, our chief diversity officer, certainly spoke to our executives, and we launched that last year, and there's been a great deal of engagement, with that resource group. And again, in addition to how we communicate, our CEO has talked about his mental health struggles. I mean, how powerful is that when the top person sends out a letter? But then when you have things like an employee resource group, that sends another powerful message that, it's safe to talk about these things. When we develop our service line strategies or department strategies for the year, in addition to talking about things like, what's your strategy around patient access? What's your strategy around quality and safety? What's your strategy around patient experience? The recognition that well-being is a quality indicator that's equally important. So, and I would say more important, although that's my bias. So, what is your strategy around well-being? Because well-being ties to all those things, Mark. So I think those are some examples. Yeah.
Brilliant. I love those. And I have a habit of digging in. I want to dig in one more level on that, to that last piece you said around service lines, and then coming up with the strategies around patient care and the various elements you'd think of if you're looking at that business, and you're asking for strategies around wellbeing. Has there been a kind of a common theme of strategies that have been, if you kind of like bottom up, if you like, that have come from the input of the folks, that consistently something comes up around wellbeing that's now been integrated and become kind of one of those norms that you talked about?
Well, I think there are examples. I actually think, Mark, on that subject, that's actually the greatest organizational opportunity, is to decentralize efforts. I think most people would say we have certainly a nationally renowned system strategy around workforce well-being, but we need, and we are getting there, to have grassroots initiatives. So what's driving workforce well-being and primary care is probably going to be different than what's driving workforce well-being in the operating room. So how do we get local empowerment, local ownership? And we're getting there. I know we're having discussions with our primary care service line about appointing somebody within that service line whose main focus is around primary care well-being. And I think being able to coordinate those efforts at a local level with a system strategy, I think is going to be very powerful and allow us to sort of take things to the next gear.
I love your comment there about the power of decentralizing efforts being potentially the greatest organizational opportunity. I think that will resonate with any leader that's listening to this, because it starts with asking the questions. I think it started with you modeling, firstly, the behaviors. and then asking the questions. And now it's giving people an opportunity to feel safe to share the realities of what would support their well-being. So I'm sure we could have a whole separate conversation on that. So I really appreciate it. But what I'd like to do next then is, so when you look at those things that have worked, if you were to fast forward 3 years, and then think kind of to the more short term, what are the biggest hurdles that are getting in the way?
Sure.
Based upon where you'd like to be in 2 to 3 years' time? What are the hurdles? What's getting in the way, and what do you think is a way of kind of getting around those or resolving it?
It's a great question, and it's certainly in no way unique to Oschner. One hurdle, and it gets back to the discussion we had about mastery and autonomy. How do we remove non-value added work that's required of us? So how do we work with our regulatory agencies and payers to, decrease clicks on the computer, get people away from the computer and actually directly interacting with patients, directly interacting with their colleagues, or directly interacting with their family and not being on the computer? So I think that's sort of a systemic issue within healthcare, and I think there's some momentum around changing that. More discussions with regulatory agencies. So that would be one hurdle. Another, I think, particularly with the non-for-profit health systems, is just the economic environment. Really, the last year, there's been unprecedented economic headwinds, so that really our budgets are now just sort of simply break even, or maybe a 1 to 2% contribution margin. And I bring that up. Obviously, we're not in healthcare to make money as an organization, but we need money to invest in programs and invest in people. And it makes it hard to experiment in the long term when you're focused, and it's very important to be focused on finances. So it really forces you to make smaller bets rather than take big bets. You don't want to make a big bet that could put your organization in a big financial hole. And I certainly think Oschner's been willing to experiment. Certainly, the fact that they experimented with my role and the office that I lead in a time where there's economic challenges. So that would be the second hurdle. And then one hurdle I think about is simply refining the business case. So, I mean, purpose makes sense and well-being makes sense. I don't think there'd be any argument. But how do you translate that to a chief financial officer outside just employee turnover, outside just the cost of replacing a physician and recruiting a new physician? How do you refine that business case in the same way that we've been able to understand how important patient access is to, the economic health of the organization and really what's better for our patients? Even we've been able to understand how important patient experience is. So I think we will get there, but really being able to be a little more granular and elegant, go from sort of intuition to analysis. And again, we've talked a lot about intuition, inspiration, authenticity, but let's get back to logic. How do you make more logical arguments around workforce well-being? And I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think we're in that directly in that sector, right? And I think that we, and sometimes we're talking to leaders that just get it intuitively, that better people, better employees, and better, stronger well-being means that you're going to be able to perform better, and aligning people's natural energy for how they like to do things in a way that enables them to do those in a more focused and sustainable and productive way. but you need to then translate those things into some of the logic, which is, well, here's the ROI, and here's the and obviously there's more and more data on that, I think, in the wellbeing space, and you guys, I'm sure, are actually probably leading the charge on a lot of that. So I appreciate you sharing those. What I'd like to close on is just kind of come full circle, really, and bring this back to you, with probably just one or two last kind of closing questions. The first one would be just really simply, like, how do you want to be remembered as a leader? What would make you proud?
Yeah, you think about that a lot more as you get to my age, but I actually want to be remembered for how I made people feel, rather than other things that I did. So, we all like to drive change and to develop strategy, but I think I'd like to be remembered as an individual that made people feel good about themselves, good about their teams, and in doing so, we're able to inspire them.
Love that. I think that's a pretty powerful message for a lot of folks that are at that stage of looking for significance, and not just the success that got them to where they're at. So last question then, hopefully ties it all together a little bit, but if you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing you'd love to be able to do that you feel would really tie together this sort of purpose, well-being, and performance for your people, and kind of bring it all together?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it won't be a terribly inspirational answer, but it gets to part of our earlier conversation, at least in healthcare. The magic wand would be to get out of the way and just let people do the things that they envisioned doing, when they went into healthcare. And that's easier said than done. I talked about, what we have to do to satisfy insurance requirements, what we have to do, think many things that are externally imposed, but the magic wand would be just
do what you came here to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, get out of the way. I love that. I think that's just a brilliant place to end, because it's such a powerful message and such a simple message, and yet such a hard thing to do. But simply by asking that question, how can we get out of our own way? How can we get out of our own way in terms of getting things out of the way of our employees, to just enable them to do what they came here to do, enable them to just be energized and do their best work and be inspired and find joy and do these things, great things together. Getting out our own way is probably the biggest thing. So I really appreciate really appreciate you sharing that. And Nigel, that's a lovely way to close out. So I know you're used to probably conversations that dig a lot more into the nuts and bolts of the healthcare system and probably some of the logic, and this probably wasn't one of those conversations.
No,
so I appreciate your patience with me on this subject matter, but again, just your authenticity of showing up and saying it how it really is. I think it's incredibly powerful for people here, so I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mark. Really enjoyed it.
We're energized about this journey and hope you choose to join us. Click the subscribe button now so you don't miss out on all the actionable wisdom to come.